Tens of thousands of people marched in Paris this past week. They were there to protest rising living costs as energy prices go through the roof because of the war in Ukraine. There is also an increasingly tense political atmosphere in France, marked by strikes at oil refineries as well as at nuclear power plants. The strikes were called by a coalition of left-wing parties. It's intended to capitalize on this cost of living crisis and assert these left-wing parties as the leading political opposition force to President Emmanuel Macron. But organizers also signal their intent to build from this social unrest and put more pressure on Mr. Macron's government. Macron finds himself in a rather perilous situation. He is simultaneously facing discontent over shortages at gas stations, along with a massive labor strike and, of course, fierce opposition in the National Assembly. At the heart of the matter are rising living costs. It was already a key topic in the French presidential elections, which concluded in the summer. It's now moved to the top of French people's concerns. In fact, according to a recent study, the issue of cost of living was far ahead of more traditional issues like climate change or security or even immigration. On Crux DeCode, will the cost of living crisis and inflation force France to soften its stand on the Ukraine war? How has Macron's stand changed since this war began? Is Macron pitching for a divergence between the United States and the rest of Europe on the future course of this war? Inflation in France has surpassed 6%, jacking up the prices of staples like meat and grain. Parliament has passed an inflation relief package back this summer, but it has not completely offset soaring energy costs, which are rising because of Russia's war in Ukraine. The situation has been compounded by strikes at many oil refineries across the country. In fact, nearly a third of all gas stations across France are either fully or partly dry. It's often forced drivers to line up for hours at petrol stations, sometimes in chaotic scenes which have gone viral on social media. Workers have been picketing for higher wages in line with inflation, as well as a greater share of surging profits of energy companies. But their demands have resonated far beyond these refineries, prompting even nuclear power plant workers and railroad workers to go on strike. Europe's decision to cave into American pressure and impose unprecedented sanctions on Moscow has heavily restricted the gas supplies into the continent. Before the war began, Europe relied for about 40% of its energy needs on Russian gas. The shortage of energy on the continent and rising prices of fuel have been met with angry voters bringing down governments across Europe. A recent poll by Elabe reveals that support for anti-Russia sanctions is on the decline across France. The survey shows only 40% of the French population are in favor of anti-Russia sanctions. The poll also reveals that about a third of the French people think that these anti-Russia sanctions must be restricted to diminish their effect on the livelihoods of the French people. The French government, like others across Europe, is adopting or considering various emergency measures ahead of the winter, like the possibility of power outages, sometimes running up to 3 hours. They're even talking about power rationing. Already we've seen similar calls both in the UK as well as in Germany. As inflation levels are biting, a group of French intellectuals, including the recent Nobel Literature Prize winner Annie Ernaux, have urged people to join the protests. They accuse President Macron of not doing enough to help the poor cope with high prices, while the profits of some companies are spiking. Now, this group of 69 signatories, which includes writers, film directors, and university teachers, they said that Emmanuel Macron is using inflation to widen the wealth gap, to boost the capital income at the expense of the rest. Now, across France, long queues have been seen outside fuel stations. The waiting line sometimes is 1.5 to 2 hours. Reports say that the strikes have reduced France's total refinery output by more than 60%. Now, this will also be seen as another blow to the French government. So the question is all of this prompting some sort of a softening of stance on the part of Emmanuel Macron vis-a-vis the Ukraine war. Macron's recent comments on the French response in case of a Russian nuclear attack on Ukraine point in that direction. It's drawn fire from observers and political opponents at home. During an interview with the French television channel France 2, the French president said that Paris would evidently not use nuclear weapons in response to a Russian nuclear attack on Ukraine. Now, the French president has since been criticized for letting Russian leader Putin's threats go easily without any fear of retaliation. Now, French presidents in the past have left open the possibility of a nuclear response if there were to be an attack. Macron, with the comments that he made, seems to have shut that door. As the leader of Europe's only nuclear power, Macron's comments that he would not respond to a nuclear attack in Ukraine are unlikely to reassure EU member states like Poland, Romania, or even Slovakia. In fact, Article 5 of the NATO Charter says that members should come to the defense of other members in case of an attack. But Macron has been breaking ranks with other European countries even earlier, not just on the question of a nuclear attack, but also on the question of NATO and its funding. Back in 2019, the French president had shocked allies in an interview when he said that he did not know whether NATO's commitment to collective defense was still valid. He went on to add that the alliance was experiencing brain death because of a lack of strategic coordination from the United States. This is what he said: "We are currently experiencing the brain death of NATO." He told this to The Economist magazine in a famous interview back in 2019. This was, of course, at a time when Donald Trump was the president of the United States, and needless to say, there was no love lost between Macron and Trump. But more recently, the leaders of more than 40 countries gathered in Prague for the first ever meeting of the European Political Community, or the EPC. It's a new forum that was created in response to the Ukraine invasion. This EPC is a bid to offer a broader, perhaps even a more inclusive European framework. But Macron's plan also risks alienating people even before the plan has been put into motion. A broader network means a more diverse cast of characters. And the danger with that is that with so many interests at play, Macron is promising all things to all people without being able to keep anybody happy. The European Political Community was originally pitched as a forum where European leaders, not specifically from the European Union, but across the continent, could discuss areas of common interest. It is the latest iteration of a concept that's been floating around for decades now. Former French President François Mitterrand touted the concept of a European confederation more than 30 years ago, but it never got off the ground. Whether Macron will be successful where Mitterrand failed, that is anyone's guess.